Hello.
Hi,
Hi.
you're sideways.
Okay. Let me correct that first off. Okay. Is that better?
Okay, yeah, better. Hi, how are
Okay.
you?
Good.
Okay. So as we're just waiting for some people to join, I'll just give
Okay.
a intro to what we're doing here. So FemCon is running a series of Instagram like live chats with activists around South Asia just to check in at this time and see how are things going on, how are things happening, what is the activity looking like during this COVID pandemic period. Um, and so this is the fifth, I believe, the fifth live chat that we're doing, and we're really, really happy to have you here. So Ermiza is a human rights lawyer based in Colombo, and yeah, she works on a broad range of things. So Ermi, I'll let you introduce yourself. In
Okay. Finally, I'm a lawyer, so working in the courts in Sri Lanka. And have for
this,
many years.
there is some background noise from your side.
Let me,
Is there
could
like
it
a
be?
fan?
It's probably the bad. Let me just check on that. Is that better?
Yeah, much better.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So, yeah. So I'm a lawyer. I've been working for a long time on various human rights issues with many organizations as well, particularly on domestic violence, gender-based violence broadly, on torture with groups that have been advocating for reform. More recently, on issues like advising and helping with advocacy on female genital mutilation, Muslim women's rights, things like that as well. So a few different areas, yeah.
Yeah. So I think the first question we start with for everyone is what has your activism looked like during these almost 3 months that we've been under curfew and in lockdown? And what are some of the issues you'd like to talk to us about today?
Okay. So in terms of things that I have been doing, I guess since the lockdown started, I mean, the initial few weeks were responding to relief needs and helping in small ways to get money across to people, basic necessities, that kind, but in very, very small ways, right? I think in the weeks to follow, I found myself also responding to calls where I was giving advice to people on domestic violence they were facing, or assisting a torture victim with a new form of new situation of violence that he was facing. Giving advice also to individuals who were contemplating divorce. So there were a range of different calls from people seeking advice at that time, asking for how to get services or what could they do, where to find help. So it kind of moved into that kind of that work, and I think I was also at that point really frustrated because there was, apart from sort of talking to people and assuring them that there is some basic protections that they can take for themselves, there was very little that you could also provide in terms of institutions that they can seek actual protection from. I think in sort of coming off that, I wrote an article with Ananda Galapathy on concerns around victims of domestic violence and recommending what services and state action would help in this situation of a lockdown. Also later on, I think I worked with a friend, Amali Vedagedara, on two articles raising issues that we had been talking about, that we felt were serious concerns that needed to be raised. One was to do with working people's rights in the wake of the fact that there was so much discussion about labor laws and loss of livelihoods and things like that. And also the other issue was households in debt and the burden that microfinance institutions had also heaped onto households and how they were faring in the wake of the pandemic. So all those things were discussions, responding in different ways, writing, assisting people, advising, things like that. So, yeah.
Okay, interesting. So I want to pick up on the domestic violence piece a bit later, but right
Sure.
now I just wanted to ask you about your thoughts on, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen a lot of incidents of police violence against civilians and against different groups of people. The most recent was this protest that happened yesterday in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, and we all saw these videos of just incredible violence. So because you have worked for a long time with torture victims and on the issues of police brutality, can you talk a little bit about your experience of this issue?
Sure. Sort of looking at the videos and the images that came out of yesterday's protest, I think those were really disturbing to see and for people to also experience that way. I think it, for me, was also reflective of how people are treated in the cases that I also represent. But looking at that level of brutality and the way in which things played out yesterday, I was thinking about the fact that there's a real sort of breakdown. I mean, it was just apparent, the breakdown of the relationship between this police, this institution, and civilians. There was no conversation, there was no explanation, that sort of basic framework within which that relationship needs to take place, that protection-related relationship, that service-based relationship that we expect from this state institution. The only response that was visible on those videos and images was violence as a first resort. And that, I think, struck a lot of people as being unacceptable. And I think we should take that position that this is not a way in which to respond to civilians. It is unacceptable in the kind of society that we want to live in. But for me, it also brought back all of my experience with victims of torture, whether they've been cases or whether they've been talking to victims about their stories and seeing them through their cases, or just working with them on advocacy-related issues. And I think, for me, it's fairly clear through those experiences that torture and ill-treatment are routine, is systemic. The kind of violence, of course, is not just the police violence. I think I've seen complaints that have come from within schools, from within our homes, and all these are institutions that are there to protect, are there to serve, are there to ensure that we flourish, right? That we are safe and able to achieve our dreams, achieve our goals in life. So it's really ironic that these are the very institutions that stifle us and sort of ensure that it's not only just to our disadvantage, but that we are scarred, that these victims are scarred almost for life, right? They have a very different understanding of life after these experiences. So it has, I think my experiences with working with victims has really shaped my understanding of justice and what democracy means in this country. And I'm left with a great sense of unfairness that sections of Sri Lankan society actually live with on a day-to-day basis. And that was something I really wanted to communicate today, because in light of what happened yesterday, and even in light of some of the several incidents of police violence that have cropped up in the media in the last few weeks, it's important to remember that this stems from a long history of violence, of and that we have the institutions, we have the laws in place to enable this violence, and we have not done anything about it. We have not demonstrated this kind of outrage and the fact that we will not accept that this is the way we want to live, right?
Can you talk a bit about like what is our legacy of this kind of violence, right? Like where does it come from? Because in the US right now they are talking a lot about like defunding and abolition of the police force, right? And how it has this history in slave patrols and this long kind of history of violence against minority communities. But what is the parallel here? What do you think? Where does it come from?
Well, I mean, I think we also have a history that is inherited, right? Colonial sort of rulers have left not only their practices but also their sort of legal, their laws, their institutions, structured in a way that it is by this kind of violence and control that we are governed. So, for example, one of the earliest pieces of sort of legislation that is relevant to this topic is colonial legislation for us, which is the Public Security Ordinance, which sets out all of our emergency regulations, curfew to be declared by the president. All of those things are means and measures, and they're very broadly worded to control. And the very first instances of control were trade union actions, were general strikes. So that was not control of, we're not talking about control or investigation or response to terrorism. We are talking about threats being seen in civil action, civil sort of organizing, civic organizing, and sort of demonstrating, and just raising concerns about what people want to see, what changes people believe are necessary, and that kind of dissent is what these laws and institutions responded to with very harsh measures. So I think the history, we haven't really changed much. We've just kind of made it stronger and more potent. And I think even the new sort of counterterrorism discourse and language is easily adopted to kind of strengthen these structures and justify the levels of violence that we're also seeing today.
I think when we talk about this kind of violence also, can you, through your practice, just tell us like who has traditionally been at the receiving end of this kind of violence? Who are really the people you take on cases for? Who are the victims?
Okay, so I think just before we get into who, I also want to talk a little bit about what I meant when I talked about police violence. And I was not too sure whether people who are listening in today would know what that word meant. So we use the word torture and we use the word brutality. And for me, sometimes when I do these cases and talk to these individuals who have gone through this experience, those words are really not enough. The feeling of how that person felt when they went through that experience really, sometimes even I can't put it down in my drafting, right? Because it's a hard thing to communicate. So what I did was I printed out a couple of images from a website of an organization that has a very long history of working with torture in Panadura, Kalutara. And I wanted to sort of show a few of them. I just wanted to warn those who are watching in that they are fairly graphic images, but I've chosen to show sort of cartoonish depiction, someone's drawings as opposed to actual people's images. But if someone's really very sensitive and finds the images distressing, maybe this is not, maybe turn away from the camera or something like that. But these are all from complaints of Sri Lankans who have gone through and described their torture in this way. So this is something that I've seen in judgments, in Sri Lankan court judgments, where people describe this, where you're put on a pole and you're turned around, and it's really painful because your
Bums, I think we lost you for a second.
Okay, where did you lose me?
When you were explaining the first picture.
Okay, so I was saying that these were images of things that victims have described happening to them, and this is where you're hung by a pole. Again, I'm really sorry for the graphic nature of the images, but I think it's important to know what happens, right? And that, so your ankles and your sort of wrists are tied together, your ankles are tied together, and this pole is passed through. So all of your body weight pulls on those joints, and it's really, really painful. The second image here is where the soles of your feet are beaten using either a pole or a stick. And that method is used mainly so that the injury is not seen because it leaves no bruises. This particular one is where your hands are handcuffed, one hand behind near your hip and the other one from the top there, handcuffs at the back. And sometimes a pole is inserted through that loop that your hands create, and then it's turned down. So there is intense pain on the joints. The handcuffs marks are the ones that usually stay. And you must have heard where victims describe a shopping bag or a plastic bag with petrol or chili powder within it. And then the shopping bag is tied over your head. Again, because you can't, like the suffocation is really, the fumes and the chili create really painful and suffocating environment, right? And the last one that I'm going to show you is being hung by your thumbs. That's the significance of this image. That they use the thumbs, tie those together, and then you're hung up. So the pain on the thumbs is intense at that point. And if you notice in the images, there's also this complaint that their clothes are removed. Again, it works on your mind as to how a person feels when that is done to them with people standing around. It's also done to embarrass, and those are the feelings that they express. So talking about how they felt, whether and like things like putting pins between your fingernail and sort of the skin, the fleshy part, just kind of describing that pain and someone telling you that story. It's really hard to imagine that, and we have to accept that this happens, right? But it's also really important to know that it happens and to know where you stand on that happening, right? So these are things that people have complained about, and common complaints about how they're treated. The people who do, or at least the ones that I've come across, are almost all from fairly poor backgrounds. Some of them may have some petty criminal record. And apart from them, I think there are also, some of them may have not so petty criminal records. I have seen those cases as well. And we can also talk about sex workers who are also ill-treated, also by the police. There are cases of those as well. So it's just the range of people. Poverty certainly, the poor category certainly seems to be a sort of a criteria. And then if you look at the history of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, you also notice the kind of ethnic dimension. So there's a class ethnic dimension to the class category of victims. There's certainly a control, there's certainly with a view to getting a confession. And this is the way in which crime then is fought, right? There's also this sense that you've done something, you've caught this criminal, and it's also punishment without due process of law, courts, all of those things. I just wanted to say that the images were from the website of Janasansabya. I don't think I named the organization, so I've sourced all those images, and maybe I can share it with you, Tihani, afterwards, and people can maybe visit the website and see those. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll put it. I have a question here. Someone is saying,
I cannot.
Sorry, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Now I can, yeah.
Okay. So one of the questions here was basically saying, you know, all the images you showed in these graphics were of men. What sort of violence is used on women in police custody?
Okay. So I can say that it's, when it comes to women, one of the things that happens is I feel violence does not get reported. We know of instances of ill treatment, harsh language, slapping, that kind of violence against sex workers, against transgender persons, and even greater violence for sure. But it's the difficulty in those individuals actually coming forward and reporting those instances of violence that makes it difficult for us to see the violence. I remember about a month or two back, there were some graphic images made public of a body of a woman stripped naked on the road with men with poles, and there was this narrative that those persons were police officers. I don't know how far that investigation went, but there are difficulties for people to report and to have the support of communities and families in being able to see a complaint through. So I don't think it doesn't happen. In my experience, I don't feel I have heard enough to understand that there is violence, but I don't think women also feel comfortable, particularly if it's of a sexual nature, to report those instances of violence. It is also the same with men. I think when men do complain of violence, they complain more readily of the forms of violence that I just showed you in the form of images, but are less likely, we know, to complain of violence in the form of sexual nature of actions, right? So it does happen.
Just to add to that, I mean, a few years ago when we were collecting evidence for the CEDAW report with sex workers, they were talking very kind of almost as a matter of fact way about custodial rape, right? Like when they are arrested, the kind of sexual bribery, exchange of sex, rape that happens in prison, just so that they can be let out on like 100 rupees bail. So just in addition to, I mean, I think we can't also look at women as a monolithic category. There are certain categories of women that face much, much more violence that we can't even imagine. I mean, when they told me, I mean, obviously I've heard about it anecdotally, but just to hear that from sex workers itself is the way they tell you the story, you know, they're just like, yeah, this happened. And it's such an everyday fact of their life is to be on the street, then get arrested, pay that bail, you know.
Yeah.
Have that experience, go back on the street, and it's like cyclical, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, and there's nothing that they can do because there is no protection, right, for them. They can't take any, and they need, they work in those areas, the police know them, everybody knows them. There's nothing that they can do to break out of that cycle.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, that was very dark and deep.
I'm sorry,
Um,
I'm sorry. I know I depress people when I talk to them about these
I think
issues. But I
it's,
mean,
yeah, it's
go
important
ahead.
for us to hear. Yeah.
No,
And
yeah, I
so
think it
just,
is.
yeah, go ahead,
Just
go
to
ahead.
see and just to feel. Sorry, I think communicating what bodies go through with the kind of violence and how everyday it is and how hard it is to even come out and say. So the fact that we don't see this violence in the papers on a daily basis is only a result of the fact that people aren't even in a position or not even free to say this. And some part of that is the culture that we as society also have created to accept to some level violence against groups or sections of society that we feel are criminal or we feel are not a part of a good society. And by accepting this degree or this level of violence, we have also normalized it, or we're happily turning a blind eye to it, which demonstrates that it is certainly police brutality or police torture is part of a larger story of violence that we need to
Yeah.
address.
And the disturbing thing is that many parts of society also endorse this kind of violence, right? Against, if it's against, suspected drug dealers, or, if they think people are petty thieves or sex workers, people are like, yeah, they deserve it, or that's how you need to get this problem under control, right? So it's disturbing how many people also endorse, like how many regular people endorse this kind of violence.
Yeah, and it's also a form of justice, right? It's a rather quick justice if there is punishment within a few days, as opposed to going through the entire legal process and a few years down the line. It isn't like there has been that narrative as well.
Yeah.
Just beat him up a little bit, it'll sort out my problem. I will feel appeased, and that is also I've heard that very many times.
Just to maybe end this portion on kind of a positive note, maybe,
Go ahead and try.
yeah, can you talk about what is the activism around this issue, right? Who is working, maybe not so much who, but what are some of the things that are being done to address this issue, and how can just like regular people who are watching now, how can they help, how can they support?
So I think there are a few groups that at least I'm aware of, um, who have been working for a long period of time tirelessly on raising consciousness, public consciousness about the fact that this happens, and sort of also being those conduits of sort of outrage when there are instances of that become public, this kind of violence. There are also groups that help victims to go through the complaints procedures and see that that they at least attempt to get the kind of justice that they are looking for. Um, I was looking at some of the statistics and in a report that an organization called Right to Life published in December last year, there were they had calculated 1,880 complaints in 5 years between 2013 and 2017, but that amounts to an incident of torture every other day, and that is of reported cases. Then that those are the complaints that got to the Human Rights Commission.
Yeah.
Um, and again, when they looked at those complaints, they saw that it's from a range of spaces: schools, law enforcement, again, these institutions that are there to protect us. Comparatively, they had found that there were only 115 sort of prosecutions started. So 1,880 cases. We're looking at like in the 25 years that we've had a law against torture. We have a Torture Act, like a Convention Against Torture has been made law. It's a criminal act, and there's high penalty. There's been 115 prosecutions that involve like 22 people. So that amounts to something like almost just over 1% converting to a prosecution. So I think just trying to help people get through the process and to get those judgments and to punish those and to hold them accountable, because there are many wrongs that happen in, not many, there are four wrongs that happen when someone experiences torture. One is the fact that as a state official, if you harm someone or you cause violence to someone, it goes against your the promise that the state makes to an individual, a citizen. Because it's there in the Constitution that says there is no excuse. Under no circumstance, come war or whatever disaster, COVID or otherwise, there is no place for torture, and every citizen has a right to say, that to be free from torture. So that is the standard that we are aspiring to, and failing by this standard so much. So the breach of that constitutional guarantee is one. They've also broken their disciplinary code. They have the whole face of that institution, that whether it's the prisons or the police, is to protect and ensure the safety of civilians, both the individual and as a society as large. And it's a breach of your own ethic and disciplinary code. So you have to be disciplinary. Also, there has to be disciplinary charges against you if you did do that. Then there's also personal wrong, because that person suffered so much, whether it's he couldn't go to work or she couldn't go back to work for several days or months or years. There have been breaking of arms, breaking of legs. So the nature of the injury or suffering could mean very many things economically. And then you need to be restituted. You need to be given back some compensation for that. So that's a compensation case. And the fourth thing is it's also criminal, right? In itself. So a crime has been committed against a human being, and the person who committed the crime has to be punished in law and an appropriate sentence given. So there are so many things that are wrong in that. It's just not one wrong. There are so many different things in terms of accountability that need to happen in response to that incident of torture.
Okay.
I realized that you were trying to end on a positive note, and we didn't do that.
If there's anything we can help.
No, sorry. I'll just quickly address that. I was thinking it's really important that we also recognize that we need to start like trust building for institutions, confidence building. It's not about preventing torture. We need to rebuild how this relationship between the state and individuals happen. And for that, each and every one of us as citizens have a role to play, because public opinion has so much power. And if you are outraged, and if you ensure that either in social media or whether you talk to people, you say that this is not acceptable. Because the moment we say, oh, it was that criminal, good thing he got beaten up, that is not what we want to, we are sending the wrong message, right? So I think reading up, look at the websites that are there that organizations have in terms of documenting, understand the nature of the problem, understand how long it's been going on and what people go through, and start that conversation within your own circles just to say no. And I think it should guide all of our decisions about who we vote for and what we say about and how we respond to these instances. So I think individually there's a lot we can do, and there's a lot that lies with us also in terms of having to do something, otherwise it won't change.
Okay, so I think is useful, because maybe we can also share some resources on how people can get involved and educate themselves as well. Now we have about 20 minutes more, so I quickly wanted to just get into the issue around domestic violence, which you wrote a piece on, I think last month with Ananda. And if you can just talk about what has that been like during curfew, right? What has been the experience of domestic violence victims during the curfew, and what has been particularly difficult about this time?
So I think in my experience, what has been the hardest is that you're trapped in one space with the person who is the one who's causing the violence. And on another day, you would have been able to leave the house. If there were children, with the children, you would have been able to just get some reprieve by going to your family member's house, having a chat, coming back. All of those support systems were cut off as a result of the lockdown. Because of the extended exposure with the person who is also causing the violence, there was also a high probability of more violence during that time. And this is in the background that domestic violence is still something that's very difficult to talk about. And people they feel like they've done something wrong if they come out and say, this is happening to me. So in that culture, this lockdown context meant real entrapment, really being trapped with the violence and the kind of psychosocial impacts of that. I think are really high for those who were experiencing it or those who reached out. And not being able to go to a police station if you actually absolutely needed to, not being able to reach out to shelters if you needed to, and we don't have those structures strongly in place, readily available, and at this point it should have been reaching out to them. That's the difference. If we had built them up to the point where when the lockdown happened, the institutions then started reaching out to people, as opposed to still expecting people to reach out to them when they couldn't, we really isolated them.
Can you just say in general, what are some of the state services that are available for domestic violence survivors at any given time? And then during this time, was there a recognition of what was happening and any kind of additional mechanisms put in place? I'm asking with a very straight face.
And I'm trying to be as fair as possible, as I would imagine that I usually am. I spoke to a few people because of the article as well. I spoke to several people to understand what was happening. It also depended on particular individuals, right? So you could always call the police if there was something. Some experienced the fact that they would come in and say, there's nothing we can do, we'll do an inquiry later after the curfew lifts. Some got involved, some removed the perpetrator from the residence and put him in his parents' home or something like that. So there were creative ways of getting around it, and there were certainly saying, oh, there's nothing we can do. But there was no, that I saw a sort of policy or institutionally sort of response that was made public to say, we support and we recognize that victims of domestic violence must be going through difficult times at this point. We are making extra efforts to ensure additional shelters. We are also letting you know that we will not remove the victim from the household, because that is also a fear. Some women said, if we complain to the police, maybe they'll come and take us to the quarantine center. There was these fears, and sort of addressing those fears was really important. But I didn't see that language, or I didn't see that kind of institutional or policy response. Also for maintenance, I think that was also a big issue, that people could not reach courts to complain about the fact that they were not getting monthly maintenance payments. And I don't know how those individuals kind of were able to sustain themselves through this time.
Okay. Just to kind of link this to a broader topic, I think that we talked about earlier, and I just want to flag it here. We have 15 minutes. This issue around criminalization, right? Particularly, for all the issues that you just talked about, but maybe we can talk in the context of domestic violence.
Right.
Can you just say, we see this increasing criminalization of kind of everyday life and of certain acts around, bodily autonomy or just the way people live their life. And again, you see also people endorsing increased criminalization in different types of ways. But when it comes to domestic violence, what is the issue with criminalization?
So the Domestic Violence Act, the law that we have, is a civil law. So it doesn't have any penal consequences if you commit domestic violence, as it were, there's no punishment in terms of imprisonment or a fine or anything like that. What you get is what the Act provides for is a protection order. So you can say it's like a restraining order. You can say, don't come, don't beat me up, basically. Don't come to the space that I am in. Don't follow me, don't harass me. Those are the orders that you can obtain. Having had conversations with sort of people who've experienced, women in particular who've experienced domestic violence, I've also seen this concern. Do you think he'll go to jail if he go to court over this? I don't want to see him go to jail. There's a real struggle, you see, with how women experience it, because they also feel like simply by coming out and talking about the domestic violence that they've let down the family unit. There are these great expectations that are placed on them to be this kind of saviors and maintainers of that family, right? And they felt that they've breached that, or they've not been successful in even doing that. So there's great regret and unhappiness about that. And then the talk that they will hear about the fact that you imprisoned your husband also scares them. So they are worried. They've said, I don't want to be seen as someone who put my husband in jail. So that bears on them. Of course, all of these thoughts are taken advantage of by the person who's committing the violence. And then there are very real fears about, okay, who's going to earn for our family if he goes to jail, right? So you see in their responses to the criminalization aspect of it, that their sense of justice, or their idea of justice in trying to seek redress for domestic violence, is about securing for themselves safety. I want to be safe. I want my children to be safe. I want my children to respect me and not, because usually there's language, abusive language, demeaning language about the wife in the relationship, and therefore she also needs to extricate herself from that situation also. So, and freedom. So they're also looking to be free. They want a moment of peace and not to be fearful in the evenings when the perpetrator comes back from work. So those are the things that they're asking for, but they also want financial security. Because if they're in a situation where they're depending on the perpetrator for food, lodging, all of these things, so those are that's the relief that even in terms of a law or policy that we need to be looking at in providing, ensuring that women are able to get out of unsafe relationships and enable them to move on to lives that they are going to flourish in, right? And I have seen people go through these cases and start working and getting a house, sort of securing for their children that kind of safety and ensuring their children's education. And it's been so heartening to see what they are so committed to doing, still also in that selfless way, but that they're unable to do that because of that situation of violence, and they feel extremely trapped, and they feel extremely, the psychosocial impact of it, I don't think has been measured because we don't have those systems that capture it, right? And what they go through must be quite, I don't know how if you manage that for several years and you still come out of it and you're still strong to make life work.
Yeah, so in this conversation about criminalization, I think what we constantly fail to do is to center the needs of the survivors, and what are they asking for? Because we look at the act and we immediately think this is a bad thing, it needs to be punished. But we're not really considering, what are the women who are at the center of this act? What do they consider justice and what are they asking for? Okay, so I think I'm about ready to wrap up. We have 10 minutes more. So if anybody has any questions for Ermiza, you can just type it in here and I will ask her. Mami, is there anything else you want to add, or just anything you want to end on?
I was just looking at the questions that you sent as well. So I was thinking if I needed to end on something, it would be about how differently we need to think about what we're doing, even just maybe based on the fact that we were talking about criminalization and how easily we endorse calls for the death penalty because it's for drug addicts, drug dealers. Um, in those conversations and in those discourses, there's a certain idea or certain ideology that is about criminalization is the way, and we do get distracted from the fact, and I think we've been distracted for far too long about individuals and how we help them and how we but in that also that relationship between that individual and the state and what that democracy means, right? Because we are always caught in these broad notions, particularly during election time, things like that, about the principles of it. And there's very little that seems to be publicly aired about what does it actually mean at the end of the day. How do we manage to get sort of our family laws right so that people don't go through terrible experiences in getting a divorce and their relationship not only between them but their children are affected for years and years on end, and how traumatic that experience is because we put it in an adversarial system. So, I mean, in our day-to-day relationships, including with the state, I think there's a fundamental need to like relook at that and see where can we make these real changes. And there are lots of opportunities to do that. MMDA advocacy for Muslim women, just looking at lived realities and just working hard to ensure that people get what they're asking for, as opposed to these distractive conversations about broad ideas about on criminalization or broad ideas about democracy, which don't trickle down to actual real needs or real delivering real services to people, is where we need to take this conversation. And that requires real sort of commitment and people with expertise in those areas getting involved. I know as a lawyer, lawyers also think that we know everything about all aspects of expertise when it comes to a case, but when it comes to family law case, I'm very, very conscious that you need those social work aspects, you need those psychosocial aspects, you need those medical aspects, you need those economic sort of financial planning aspects, which need to come together. You can't just do it only through a legal system as a legal remedy. So yeah, I'm hoping that whoever is in government really takes it seriously, because we haven't looked at these things for a long time, and that is where really assisting people, meaningful change for people lies. I didn't see any questions come through, so
no,
I'm
yeah,
assuming.
I didn't either. So I think that's kind of a good place to stop. So thank you so much for coming and talking to us. And I know you're the most busiest person I know. So thanks for sparing an hour for us to really talk about something that's super serious, and it's like really relevant and really serious, and it's something that people need to be thinking about and learning about. The police brutality conversation as well as the domestic violence issue. So thanks so much, Ermi, and thank you everybody for joining in. And I think this video will be available on our feed for somebody who wants to watch afterwards, and there'll be more coming in this series. Thanks a lot.
Do share the resources. Bye.
Bye.